you've mentioned climate change a couple of times now. So
Yes.
Labour and the Green Party are both aiming for the country to be carbon neutral by 2030. The Liberal Democrats are saying 2045. Is that really going far enough, Chris?
Well, I think it's interesting about the Labour have sort of backtracked ever so slightly. Their conference endorsed 2030. And at the time we put out our leaflets, we hadn't seen their manifesto. They've sort of slightly backtracked on that, and with good reason, because it's simply not a realistic target. I mean, it's easy to get into a bidding war, as we've seen on spending between Labour and the Tories, and as we've seen on these deadlines between the Greens and Labour. But you've got to live in the real world, and so sort of we talk to people at the front line of environmental work, and Friends of the Earth, the World Wildlife Fund, the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, all endorsed 2045 as a realistic target for reducing carbon emissions to zero. I mean, within that, we want a fast start. So the easy stuff, the stuff that doesn't involve fundamentally changing people's lives and doesn't, the real hard yards, the easier stuff, we're hoping will allow us to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. And by that 2030 date, we also would anticipate having 80% of our electricity from renewable sources. Okay. So we are setting ambitious targets, but this is the thing, and I think this is the thing that marks out our manifesto from the other main parties' manifestos. Our manifesto is rooted in realism. It's rooted in it's rooted in the possible, in what can be done, in what can be achieved, what can be paid for, what targets can be met. It's not a fantasy in the way that so much of Labour's. I mean, you can't argue with a lot of Labour's propositions, but they're just not deliverable. And in its own way, it's as mendacious as anything Boris Johnson is doing.
Okay. So you've mentioned about energy from renewable sources. What other policies do the Liberal Democrats have to help achieve that 2045 target?
Well, what we're looking at is subsidies for. We're going to put 100 billion. That's the top line. Is 100 billion into fighting climate change, because it is the single greatest threat. I mean, this election, people have thought of it as the Brexit election, which is quite sad in many ways, because it should be the climate election, given everything that's happening, everything that we see, all the indicators we see around the world of the climate emergency. It's not a crisis, it's an emergency. And that we're going to throw 100 billion at it, and we're going to invest, as I say, in tidal power, in onshore and offshore wind, in solar power. We're going to reintroduce the subsidies for electric vehicles that the Tory government cut as soon as the coalition came to an end. We're going to make sure that the sale of petrol and diesel cars is banned by 2030. We're going to expand the rail network, but make it an ultra-low emission rail network by 2035. So looking at hydrogen technology and clean electricity to run our rail network. We're going to put 4.5 billion into clean buses to try and take cars off the road. We're going to we're going to tell councils that they have to introduce a zero carbon policy with an independent body that'll monitor their efforts to reach those targets, and if necessary, introduce sanctions if they're not hitting those targets.
So our Conservative Council here has failed at the moment to set any targets.
Absolutely.
About being carbon neutral, and they're concerned about the livelihoods of farmers in the constituency and things. What would you say to people who share those concerns?
Well, what I would say about that one is that there you have, in a nutshell, the difference between 2030 and 2045. We're talking about changing the diet of a nation. You're talking about taking our agricultural sector in a different direction, and that's not something you can do in 10 years. You're talking about fundamental change in the way we all live to make that target viable. It's an enormous task. And that's why we set a target that is realistic, because, as I say, the meat and dairy sectors, yes, we know that cattle contribute substantially to greenhouse emissions, and that is a problem, and it is going to take time to solve. But it is a problem we're confident we can get to grips with. But we need the time to introduce the right subsidies, the right incentives, encourage the right cultural change that'll be required amongst the population in terms of the way they eat. So yeah, that's why I target at 2045. It looks unambitious next to the Greens. It's not unambitious. It's honest.
Okay.